If you have an older brother or sister, you probably know the feeling of wanting to be just like them, especially when you were a kid, right? You go through a phase where we look up to the older kids ahead of us. They can't do anything wrong, and their attention means everything to us. I remember imitating some of the kids that were older than me that I knew because I really looked up to them and I wanted to be like them. And now I realize that some of that was just me trying to figure out who I was. Was I supposed to just be a younger version of that person I so admired? Or was I supposed to be something different with my own interests? I may not have used those words, but there was this big question that I was asking. Who am I? Now, like me, you might not actually be asking yourself, who am I? But you may have thought about some version of that question. What we're really questioning is our identity. Identity is what makes us us. It's what makes us unique and causes us to be different from everybody else. If you're like me, sometimes you struggle to even begin to understand how to answer that question. Now, the tricky thing is, most of the time, we're not asking the question with just ourselves in mind. We're deciding who we are based on the people around us, or what they think of us, and based on who they are. And we can tend to base our identity on what others expect of us. We think that other people want us to be or need us to be a certain way, and we constantly feel the pressure to live up to expectations from family, friends, coaches, teachers. Our parents want us to be responsible, so we see responsible as part of who we are. Our coach wants us to be a leader, so that's part of our identity. And it's not who we actually are as much as it is what people think we should be. Now, at the same time, we tend to base our identity on areas where we feel judged. We see ourselves through the lens of not being enough of whatever they expect from us. We're not blank enough, not funny enough, not tall enough, not confident enough, not smart enough. The list goes on and on, right? And we define who we are based on areas where we feel like we don't measure up. Maybe you feel like you have to act or be a certain way because of your race or your culture. And for you, maybe you realize that you're more than labels or judgments others have put on you, but you're not sure what that means. You just know that the picture others draw of you is not complete. There's more to you than that. Now, also, we tend to base our identity on our image, how we appear to others. Others see us as the star athlete, so that's how we see ourselves. Our teachers see us as a below average student, so that's how we see ourselves. But no matter how we would explain our identity, the question for all of us is the same. The question underneath is, who am I? But this one big question feeds our insecurity and drives the decisions that we make and determines the friends that we have. The real question is, am I enough? Now, some of you may answer yes to that question, and that's great. But you'd probably say, yes, I'm enough, but, and you would have areas that you would point out where you don't feel like you measure up. Because let's be honest, the areas where we don't measure up seem to occupy more of our thinking than the areas where we do, right? Others of you may answer that question by saying, no, I'm not enough because blank. No matter what anyone tells us, we just have a hard time believing that we could ever be enough. But however you answer that question, here's the good news. What we talk about today has the potential to be a game changer for you in the way that you answer the question, am I enough from now on? I probably don't have to tell you this, but people have been wondering, am I enough since the beginning of time? Now, today we're going to look back at an interaction between Jesus and a group of people in the book of John, which is one of the 4 books of the Bible that talk about Jesus' life on earth. In John's book, chapter 6, verse 1 through 7, he records a miracle that Jesus performed. Check this out. John says that after this, Jesus went across the Galilee Sea, that is the Tiberias Sea, and a large crowd followed him because they had seen the miraculous signs he had done among the sick. So Jesus went on a mountain and he sat down with his disciples, and it was almost Passover time, which is the Jewish festival. Jesus looked up and saw the large crowd coming towards him, and he asked Philip, "Where will we buy food for these people?" Jesus said that to test him because he already knew what he was going to do. And Philip replies, "Jesus, there's more than a year and a half salary worth of food wouldn't be enough to feed all these people, even a little bit." So right away there's a problem. Jesus could tell that the people are hungry. The disciples are freaking out. I mean, I would be too. Look, hungry people become hangry people really fast, and I lose my mind if I have to skip a meal. So the disciples are wondering what to do. None of the disciples make nearly enough money to buy food for all these people. But Jesus doesn't seem worried. See what happens next. Verse 8 and 9 says, one of his disciples, Andrew, which is Simon Peter's brother, says, "Hey, there's a youth here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that for a crowd like this?" Andrew mentions that there's a youth who has some food. We're not told if it's a boy or a girl, it's just a young person, just maybe a child. And in first century culture, that would have made that kid not so valuable in the eyes of society. In fact, children tended to be viewed almost as property, and the only value children had was in what they could do for their family. But there's something else to notice here. The young person didn't have regular bread, they had barley bread. And it's interesting that John includes that detail because back then that was the kind of bread that poor people ate. That was the kind of bread you ate when you didn't have much else to eat. You didn't have money or status. This kid didn't come from a family with a bunch, but he or she was willing to use what they had anyway. Now, John continues in verse 10 through 15. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now, there was plenty of grass there, and so they sat down, about 5,000 of them. And Jesus took the bread, and when he had it in his hand, he gave thanks and distributed it to those who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, and each person got as much as they wanted. And when they had plenty to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftovers so nothing gets wasted." And they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the 5 pieces of barley loaves and the fish that was left over. Now when the people saw that he had done a miraculous sign, they said, "This is truly the prophet who is coming into the world." Jesus understood that they were about to come and force him to be their king, so he took refuge again, alone on the mountain. Jesus did something miraculous and extraordinary, something only someone with supernatural power could do. He took a little bit of barley bread and fish and he fed a huge crowd. There was so much food, there were even leftovers. Now that's crazy miracle, right? But Jesus is the obvious hero of the story, yet John makes it a point to draw attention to a different hero, the unnamed, ungendered youth in the story. Not from wealth, not from privilege, not having much to offer. Still front and center. I wonder if John doesn't want us to forget the role Jesus allowed that kid to have in the story. Jesus could have provided that food with no help at all. I mean, he made blind people see, he brought dead people back to life. It would not have taken much for him to bring food out of nowhere. But that's not what happened. Jesus takes food from a barely noticed child and makes that child a piece of history. Why? Because Jesus knew who that kid was. That kid was made in the image of God, and that alone made them a part of the story worth celebrating. Jesus was not limited by what that kid did or did not have. And the same is true for us. Jesus says that what we have and who we are is enough. Think about it this way. You don't have to prove you're enough. That feeling of not being enough is a normal part of being human. At some point or another, we all deal with it. And in response, we may try to prove that we have what it takes. We practice harder, we study harder, work harder, put in more effort. We try to prove that we're the best athlete, the most accomplished student, or the employee of the month. But what we try to hide so that no one notices is feelings like we're not enough, which feed our insecurities. And so we do everything we can to keep people from seeing that. So what can we do when those feelings come up? Well, let's start by asking these 3 questions. Where in my life do I feel like I'm not enough? Around friends, at home, grades, sports, church. When I don't feel like I'm enough, do I tend to respond by hiding, by proving myself, or something else? How different would my life look if I stopped trying to prove myself or hide in that area? Or to put it another way, what would it look like to believe Jesus when he says that I'm enough? Now, when I feel that way, how am I going to remember that I am enough? A tip from my experience: memorize what God said is true about you, and that helps so much when you start to believe differently. Ephesians 2:10 is a good place to start. And Paul writes, "We are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." That first phrase is a great place to start. We are God's handiwork, a piece of art. When we battle not being enough, one of the worst things we can do is to believe that we have to face that alone. That's why we care so much about small groups and small group leaders, because everybody needs someone to remind them what is true when it doesn't feel true to them. I imagine even the youth in the story we just read wanted to provide for more than just themselves. I imagine that the youth wanted to do something to help, right? But that's why they offered their food to Jesus. But it's important to note that Jesus was able to create a miracle, to create enough where there wasn't enough. Being enough is about more than feeling good about yourself, although that's important. It's also about knowing that you have everything you need to be a force for good in the lives of others. Now imagine what might be possible if you started believing that you're enough and that God can use what you have to make you a force for good in the lives of others. And what if the people in your small group started to believe that they were enough? What if you walked into school believing that about yourself so that you could take a break from trying to prove or hide? Imagine what you could feel instead. I really believe it could change you and the people around you. You don't have to prove you're enough. Jesus says you're enough, and that's really great, and it's really true.